a war souvenir that turns into a fiery explosion, harmless-looking butterflies that can tear someone apart, and a rat that could bring down an entire factory. During World War II, armies turned everyday objects into weapons that maimed and killed long after the battle ended. On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're delving into the 10 most insane booby traps that made World War II soldiers afraid to touch anything. Number 10. The tripwire was the most common booby trap of World War II. Usually it was connected to a grenade or a mine. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, that is where you'd be wrong. The real genius was in the placement. German forces would string them out across doorways at ankle height, knowing exhausted Allied troops stumbling through the bombed-out buildings wouldn't see them until it was too late. Things got a bit nasty when they started placing the wire at chest height too, so even if a soldier spotted the low wire and carefully stepped over it, they would walk right into the higher one. The Japanese took tripwires and mines to another level in the Pacific. They would rig them to entire trees in the jungle, turning the forest itself into a weapon. One wire could bring down a massive log or release a bundle of grenades suspended in the canopy above. Marines learned quickly that if the jungle looked too clear, like unnaturally clear, that was exactly where you did not want to walk. By mid-1943, Allied training manuals had entire sections on tripwire detection. Soldiers were taught to move slower, look for disturbed vegetation, and check for wire glints. But slowing down meant more exposure to sniper fire. It was a classic lose-lose situation. But ordinary tripwires and wired explosives were child's play compared to where we're headed next. Number 9. What is one thing a soldier can't resist taking? The enemy's gear. And sometimes it is the last thing they ever touch. The Germans knew this and they weaponized it to great effect throughout the war. Their Sprengfallen and Minenfallen turned curiosity into carnage. Helmets, rifles, and even bars of chocolate became delivery vehicles for unexpected instruments of death. Allied soldiers entering liberated European villages were walking into a literal death trap. Sure, the Nazis were gone, but their presence lingered in the most dangerous way possible. That helmet lying in the dirt, rigged to a bomb. That rifle propped up against the wall, rigged to a bomb. The door handle of that newly empty farmhouse, definitely hiding a bomb. Even the lamp beside it could mean an untimely end. Germany's genius lay in predicting human behavior. As the Wehrmacht retreated, it littered Europe with explosives. They left binoculars on desks, maps spread invitingly open, and ammunition boxes with pins half pulled from grenades inside. In North Africa, the Afrika Korps made a game out of it. They'd leave behind abandoned ammo boxes. When an Allied soldier flipped the lid, the movement yanked loose the pins, leaving only a few seconds to realize the mistake. One trick involved a framed photograph left hanging crooked on the wall of a captured house. The Germans reasoned that only an officer would bother to straighten it, and when he did, the concealed detonator behind the frame rewarded this neatness with a flash and a bang. Sometimes the traps targeted engineers. A landmine might be fitted with a second hidden charge designed to kill the man trying to disarm it. Even duds, or the Allied grenades, mortar rounds, or bombs that failed to go off, were recycled into delayed devices, ready to punish anyone poking around for souvenirs or spare parts. But the cruelest inventions were those that preyed on comfort or survival. This included food and water caches wired to explode, blankets, utensils, even bars of soap fitted with detonators. The bait traps worked. Allied troops stopped trusting anything. Abandoned gear, safe houses, even corpses might hide a trap. The physical damage was bad enough, but the psychological toll was worse. By war's end, men had learned to fear curiosity itself. And if you think that is cruel, wait until you hear what they did with wounded soldiers. Number 8. This one is straight up evil, and it basically violated every rule of warfare that existed at the time. From time to time, German forces were known to wire their own dead soldiers as booby traps. It's pretty grim, but in the dense woods of the Hürtgen forest, a group of German soldiers took cruelty to another level, turning wounded men into alluring traps. The idea was as simple as it was monstrous. A wounded man's cries would draw medics or rescuers. The instant they tried to move him, a hidden charge would detonate. Private William H. Edwards of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division became the guinea pig for this horrific experiment during a night patrol gone wrong in the forest. He stepped on a mine that tore off his right foot, but somehow he survived the blast, left helpless and exposed near German lines. At dawn, he shouted for help, drawing 2 American medics to his position along with a group of unfriendly German soldiers nearby. The medics came under fire and were forced to retreat. Later that night, 3 Germans approached the wounded American. At first, Edwards hoped for mercy. Instead, they looted his pockets, stole his jacket and cigarettes, and began wiring explosives beneath his back. When they finished, he was the centerpiece of a human booby trap. One twitch, one attempted rescue, and he would take his saviors with him. Edwards lay trapped for nearly 3 days, bullets shredding the trees above him, artillery bursting nearby. He stayed awake by smoking the few cigarettes the Germans had missed, terrified that if he lost consciousness, some well-meaning rescuer would die trying to help. When 2 fellow infantrymen finally found him, Edwards warned them to keep clear and calmly directed how to cut each wire. After 70 hours of agony, Edwards was freed. The tactic was pure evil. It made compassion lethal and mercy suspect. By the end of the war, medics approached the wounded with poles, ropes, or dread. We'll stick with the Germans, who were the poster children of overkill booby traps. Here's another weapon that gave Allied soldiers nightmares decades after the war ended. Number 7. The German S-mine, nicknamed Bouncing Betty by Allied forces, was an engineering masterpiece designed for maximum carnage. It worked by stepping on its trigger or tripwire, and that is strike 1. Unlike a traditional mine, it didn't explode immediately. Instead, a small charge was ignited, which launched the mine about 3 to 4 feet into the air, roughly waist height. Then, the main charge detonated, spraying 360 degrees of shrapnel at the abdomen and chest. The Germans deployed millions of these across Europe, and they were absolutely devastating. The blast radius could wound or kill anyone within 65 feet. Just one could take out an entire squad. In another game of psychological gymnastics, soldiers who triggered one had a few seconds between the initial click and the launch. About enough time to know you were about to die or be catastrophically injured, but not enough time to do anything about it. Some soldiers tried running, that didn't work. Others tried to lie flat, and the mine would bounce right over them and detonate anyway. These mines were so effective that they remained in use long after World War II. Modified versions were deployed in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Even today, unexploded S-mines are still discovered in European construction sites, requiring careful disposal by bomb squads. Allied forces eventually deployed mine rollers to mitigate against their danger. These giant drums pushed ahead of tanks to detonate pressure mines. But in infantry combat, there was no good answer to the Bouncing Betty. Number 6. By 1944, German mine warfare had stopped being merely crude metallic rounds thrown into earthen pits and started looking like something you would see out of a top-secret weapons lab. The old Teller mines were still ubiquitous and brutal, but the Nazis stepped up their game with a different kind of German engineering. Enter the Topf mine. At first glance, it was an utterly unremarkable, flat, circular blast mine. Up close, it was something far more sinister and sophisticated. Built from compressed wood pulp, cardboard, tar, and the occasional glass plug, the Topf mine was a minimal metal device expressly designed to fool Allied metal detectors. Often the only metal in the entire apparatus was the detonator itself. To help their own troops locate minefields, German engineers coated some of the mines with a gritty black paint called Tarnsand. While Allied mine detectors struggled to pick up its signal, German ones had no trouble. Tarnsand was slightly radioactive, and their detectors included a crude Geiger counter. The result was a mine that hid from your enemy's tools but not from those of its makers. At the same time, German engineers pushed the idea of attacking armor from below. They came up with the Panzerstabmine 43, basically a buried rocket launcher disguised as a mine. It looked like a small rod sticking up from the ground. When a tank rolled over it, the rod bent sideways, triggering a powder charge that launched a Panzerfaust warhead straight into the tank's belly. The mine got the 5-inch shaped charge to punch clean through a patch of 4 inches armor that an ordinary infantryman could never hope to reach. Even heavy tanks could not shrug that off. Its evil twin, the hole-sprung 4672, added an even nastier trick. That mine, like the Bouncing Betty, jumped before exploding. A buried charge would pop the warhead upward before detonation, hitting the tank's vulnerable thin underbelly as opposed to its tracks and rollers. They were clever, terrifying, and ahead of their time. But like other German Wunderwaffen, these innovations came too late. Germany was collapsing, factories were in ruins, and the warheads themselves were more valuable as Panzerfausts for desperate infantry. Only about 59,000 of those rocket mines were built before production stopped in 1945. And if you think that's crazy, Germany had an even more sinister innovation up their sleeve, a device that made bomb disposal experts seriously reconsider their career choices. Number 5. By 1942, Allied forces had gotten pretty good at defusing German mines and booby traps. They had the techniques, the tools, and the training to keep infantrymen relatively safe when the situation allowed it. But soon, the Germans raised the stakes. They introduced what became known as anti-lifting devices, turning ordinary mines from passive hazards into lethal booby traps, ready to kill any engineer who thought that he could simply pull one out of the ground. One simple but effective measure was the delay igniter. This secondary fuse was wired to a mine that only fired after a longer than usual pause, typically around 30 seconds when the mine was disturbed. That delay was purposely long enough to pull in comrades who would be in the blast radius. And then came the dummy tripwire trick. Imagine a fake tripwire stretched across the ground. Obvious, right? You cut it, confident you have neutralized the trap. But underground, a second hidden wire connects that mine to a stake. Tug the stake even a little, and the hidden wire yanks like a pole fuse. Game over. The infamous Bouncing Betty got its own upgrade. Germans wired extra charges to it, so lifting one mine could detonate another hidden one beside it. Some versions even had wooden stakes with tiny explosives wired in, basically an explode if you breathe on it setup. And then there was the pressure release system. The mine literally sat on a spring rod. Its own weight kept the striker locked. Pick it up, the rod pops up, releases the striker, and boom! It was like setting off a grenade by removing your own safety pin. These traps turned mine clearing into pure nightmare fuel. Engineers had to invent new tactics with ropes, pulleys, and even at times using other explosives to blow mines from a distance. Number 4. Technically, spider holes themselves weren't booby traps, they were camouflaged fighting positions, but what the Japanese did with them absolutely qualifies. In the Pacific Theater, Japanese forces often dug elaborate tunnel systems and spider holes that fit 1 or 2 soldiers. These holes were nearly invisible, covered with jungle vegetation and located in areas you would never think to look, even right in the middle of cleared paths. This Japanese tactic was to wait in the holes until Allied forces passed over or near them. Then instead of shooting, which would give away their position, they would rig grenades with modified fuses and toss them at passing troops before disappearing back underground. Some would even booby-trap the entrance to their own spider holes, so if Marines discovered the position and tried to clear it, grenades would detonate. On Iwo Jima alone, over 11 miles of tunnels were discovered, many of them booby-trapped. Marines developed a grim protocol to clear those dens of death. They would dump gasoline or satchel charges into any hole they found and detonate first, asking questions never. The psychological impact of tunnel warfare was ruthless by Japanese design. American soldiers couldn't trust the ground beneath their feet. They couldn't trust cleared areas. The Japanese wanted to force the Americans to fight on their own terms in the hopes of attriting Allied morale. Instead, the strategy backfired. Even after islands were declared secure, spider holes were still being discovered months later, some still occupied by Japanese soldiers who didn't know the war was virtually over. Resorting to tunnel warfare convinced many Allied strategists that Japan would never accept defeat. Rather than face similarly desperate tactics in an invasion of Japan itself, Truman opted instead to drop the atomic bombs. Number 3. We return to our normal German programming with another cruel entry. Imagine a tiny metal can that opens like a little butterfly as it falls from the sky, and then it hides itself in plain sight. That was the SD-2 butterfly bomblet, a German submunition dropped in clusters which was expressly designed to wound but also terrorize and booby-trap entire Allied neighborhoods. When the SD-2 container opened, dozens of these 4.4-pound cylinders spun as their spring wings flipped out. That motion wound an arming spindle, such that after a few turns the internal fuse armed in midair. By the time the bomblet hit the ground, it was a fully live and highly sensitive little grenade. Small, cheap to mass produce, and absolutely lethal. Each one exploded into hundreds of razor-sharp fragments, deadly within 33 feet and dangerous far beyond. Butterfly bombs were nearly perfect booby traps because of their variety and unpredictability. Each bomblet could be fitted with a different fuse, one that detonated on impact or a few seconds after arming, a clockwork time delay that waited minutes before killing, or a cruel anti-handling fuse that turned any attempt to remove it into a death sentence. Luftwaffe crews deliberately mixed fuse types in the same cluster, so after a raid people couldn't tell whether a dud on the street was a delayed killer trap or a trap set for the rescue team. That deadly mixture achieved two goals simultaneously. They caused physical casualties and treatment paralysis. A single unexploded butterfly bomblet meant others were almost certainly nearby, so households, emergency crews, and ordnance teams would spend hours or days evacuating, cordoning, and nervously waiting for the next explosion. The bombs left a long tail of danger. They caused civilian deaths in places like Ipswich, Grimsby, and Cleethorpes during bomb raids over Britain in 1943. Unexploded bomblets have turned up and still occasionally kill decades later. The next entry is often associated with jungle warfare in the Vietnam War, but found equal application in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Number 2. If you want a booby trap that is equal parts primitive and horribly effective, meet the Punji pit. It's almost a stupidly simple trap to set. Troops would dig a shallow pit, line it with sharpened stakes, bamboo, wood, even sharpened metal, and then camouflage the top with foliage or a thin mat and wait. When a soldier falls in, the stakes do the rest, tearing flesh, breaking bones, and turning a battlefield wound into a nightmare to treat. Japanese defenders used Punji pits all over the Pacific, including Burma, Bataan, and countless other islands. They were cheap, quiet, and brutal. What made them especially sickening was the follow-up to the initial injury. Stakes could be smeared with feces or decaying contaminants that all but ensured sepsis and gangrene. A seemingly minor puncture easily became limb-threatening as medics in the jungle scrambled to stave off infection. Punji defenses were often integrated with tripwires along likely avenues of approach, or set inside narrow choke points so squads would funnel into them. Some pits were shallow nail beds meant to maim or slow rather than kill outright. The Japanese knew that an immobilized soldier was a huge drain on the medical resources and morale of a unit watching a comrade suffer. Primitive, cheap, and devastating, Punji pits were strong reminders that sometimes the worst weapons were the simplest. Number 1. The exploding rat sounds like a prank, but members of Britain's Special Operations Executive (SOE), the real-life inspiration for James Bond's gadget shop, took it deadly seriously. They spent part of their wartime labors skinning lab rats, packing their bodies with plastic explosives, and carefully sewing them up. The plan was to stick a rat among coal in a German boiler room, where a disgusted worker might just throw it on the fire and unsuspectingly blow the boiler to pieces. SOE bought about 100 of the rodents and prepared them for clandestine use. On one occasion, an officer even posed as a student to buy them. And it almost worked. Almost. One container of explosive rats were intercepted by German authorities before it reached the continent. Yet, the disappointing seizure somehow produced an unexpected strategic win. The Germans exhibited the mutilated rodents at military schools and headquarters, sparking a continent-wide paranoia. Soldiers and sailors were ordered to search for dozens of rat carcasses the enemy believed were scattered everywhere. SOE later reported that the moral panic the discovery caused was a much greater success than if the rats had been used as intended. In other words, rumors sabotaged them. Exploding rats weren't a lone piece of eccentricity. The Boffins at Aston House also designed explosive coal that could wreck furnaces, Chianti bottles made of celluloid and packed with plastic explosives, bicycle pumps hollowed out and wired to detonate, and Balinese wood carvings cast entirely from explosive material to be sold to enemy troops. These small deceptive devices weren't meant for mass casualties, they were meant to disrupt, to wreck boilers, to halt production, and tie up repair crews. When everyday objects could hide a bomb, occupation became costly, slow, and full of doubt. And that uncertainty was exactly the point. Those World War II booby traps were ingenious, but the weapons some nations built were even stranger. Watch Weirdest World War II Weapons You Never Heard Of to see the bizarre inventions that actually made it to the battlefield. Or click on this video instead.